work. Their hands gripped the handles of their tools, knuckles turning white against the wood. They did not move. They did not speak. They simply watched the exchange, their gaze locked on the scene unfolding at the base of the hill. Every muscle in their bodies tightened as the reality of the moment took hold. The air between the brothers and the house seemed to grow cold, heavy with the realization that the balance of their household had shifted forever. One by one, they dropped their tools into the dirt. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of wind through the stalks. The hierarchy of the family had been dismantled in a single gesture, and in that quiet, narrow space, the seeds of a deep, corrosive hatred took root. The brothers did not return to the harvest. They stayed where they were, rooted in the dirt, watching the distance between them and the house like a widening chasm. One brother spat into the dust, the sound sharp against the stillness of the fields. Another gripped a heavy stone, his thumb tracing the jagged edges until the skin broke, yet he did not flinch. They communicated in brief, jagged gestures, a nod toward the house, a hard stare, a hand resting on the hilt of a harvesting knife. The work they had been doing was forgotten. They moved as a single unit now, pacing the perimeter of the barley, their eyes never leaving the figure of Joseph as he moved about the yard. Every time he turned, they shifted, tracking him with the cold, predatory focus of wolves, waiting for the light to fail. They were no longer brothers in a house. They were strangers bound by a singular, gnawing resentment. They gathered their tools, but not to work. They held them at their sides, blades catching the late afternoon sun, the metal glinting with a dull, threatening resolve. The choice had been made, even before a word was spoken. They would not tolerate the weight of his presence a day longer. Joseph walked into the center of the field, his gate light unaware of the perimeter they had formed. He stopped, his face bright with the memory of what he had seen in his sleep. He began to speak, his voice cutting through the heavy air of the valley. He told them of the field, of the sheaves they had bound together, and of how his own sheaf had stood upright while theirs bowed low to the ground. For a heartbeat, the wind seemed to die completely. The brothers did not look at one another. They looked only at him. Their faces were masks of stone, eyes narrowing until they were mere slits of focus. The meaning was not lost on them. It was a claim to dominion, a prophecy of their own subservience that stung more than any physical blow. One brother tightened his grip on his staff, the wood groaning under the pressure of his hand. Another took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance until he stood directly in Joseph's shadow. The air grew brittle. They did not shout. They did not argue. They listened with a mounting cold rage that hardened in their chests. The dream had been spoken, and in that moment, the hierarchy of the family was not just challenged, it was erased. They stared at him, waiting for him to finish, their minds already turning toward how to silence the boy who dared to dream of their submission. Joseph did not stop with the wheat. He looked toward the darkening sky and spoke of the sun, the moon, and 11 stars, all of them bowing in the heavens until they touched the earth at his feet. The audacity of the vision hung in the air like smoke. Even Jacob, who had listened with a weary, patient expression, straightened his back. He stood, his hands gripping his staff, his eyes fixed on his son with a mixture of confusion and sudden sharp clarity. "Shall I and your mother and your brothers come to bow ourselves before you?" Jacob asked, his voice low and trembling with the weight of the question. The brothers did not wait for an answer. The mention of their own parents bowing was the final spark in a pile of dry kindling. They pushed forward, not as men, but as a singular force of rejection. One brother knocked over a stack of tools, the metal ringing out across the valley like a warning bell. Their breath came in quick, ragged bursts. The envy that had simmered for weeks now boiled over into a terrifying singular purpose. They stood in a tight circle, their shadows stretching long and distorted across the soil, their eyes fixed on Joseph as if he were already a ghost. They had heard enough. The hierarchy was shattered, and the path to violence was now wide open. The morning sun rose high, casting long, sharp shadows across the path that led away from the safety of home. Joseph walked alone, his pace steady, carrying the provisions his father had requested. The road ahead was quiet, save for the crunch of dry earth beneath his sandals and the distant, rhythmic hum of insects in the tall grass. He hummed a soft tune to himself, his mind occupied by the simplicity of his task, entirely unaware of the shift in the world behind him. He did not look back. He did not notice the absence of birdsong in the trees lining the route. He moved forward with a sense of purpose that felt misplaced in the stillness of the valley. Every step brought him closer to the far fields, where the air felt heavy and stagnant. He rounded a bend in the path, his eyes scanning the horizon for the familiar shapes of his brothers working the rows. He saw them then, clustered in the distance, unnaturally still, waiting. He raised a hand in greeting, his fingers catching the light, and quickened his stride. He was walking toward the center of a gathering storm, his footsteps echoing against the silence, leading him straight into the waiting trap of those who had already decided his fate. The greeting died in his throat. Before he could lower his hand, the nearest brother lunged. Joseph was slammed into the dirt, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs. He tried to scramble away, but heavy hands pinned his shoulders to the ground. They worked with systematic, cold efficiency. With a violent pull, they tore the garment from his back, leaving him exposed to the biting wind. He shouted, but a hand clamped over his mouth, stifling the sound. They dragged him across the jagged stones, his heels digging furrows into the earth, until he reached the edge of the dry, abandoned well. He did not have time to plead. With a collective shove, he was sent into the dark. He hit the bottom hard, the dry, uneven rock bruising his ribs and limbs. He gasped, the air thin and smelling of dust. Above him, the opening was a narrow circle of blinding light, framed by the silhouettes of his brothers. They did not look down. They turned their backs and walked away, leaving him to the silence of the earth. Joseph lay still, his breath hitching in his chest, staring at the patch of sky that was slowly drifting out of his reach. The silence of the pit was broken by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Joseph pushed himself upright, his hands raw from the grit of the walls. Above, the voices grew sharper. Reuben spoke first, his tone urgent and low, pleading for his brother's release. But the others drowned him out with cold, clipped commands. Then, the rhythmic thud of camel feet vibrated through the ground. A caravan of Ishmaelites emerged from the shimmering heat of the horizon. The brothers moved with renewed speed. They reached down into the darkness, grabbing Joseph by the arms and hauling him upward. He scrambled for purchase on the jagged rock, his feet sliding until he was dragged into the blinding glare of the sun. He stood trembling as the coins were counted. 20 pieces of silver, heavy and cold, changing hands in the dust. He did not fight. The presence of the armed traders left no room for escape. He was bound, his wrists pulled tight, and pushed toward the caravan line. He looked back one final time. He watched his brothers turn away, their silhouettes shrinking against the vast, empty desert. They moved with a steady, uncaring rhythm, disappearing into the haze, leaving Joseph to face the long, unknown road ahead with the strangers who had bought him. The desert heat did not erase the crime. It only demanded a cover for it. One of the brothers knelt by the tethered goat, the blade flashing once in the midday sun. They worked with grim, practiced efficiency, catching the thick, dark liquid in a basin. They dipped the tattered garment into the basin, swirling the fabric until the original color was lost beneath the deep, wet crimson. They did not speak as they walked back to the family encampment. They arrived as the sun dipped low, casting long, jagged shadows across the tent floor. They held the stained item out, presenting it to Jacob without a word. Jacob reached out, his fingers trembling as he touched the damp, heavy material. He lifted it, turning it over in the fading light. He did not ask how it happened. He did not need to. The reality of the stain shattered his composure. A single jagged wail tore through the evening air, a sound of absolute, hollow grief that silenced the camp. Jacob dropped to his knees, his hands clutching the blood-soaked fabric to his chest, his eyes fixed on the empty horizon. The brothers stood in the shadows, watching as their father broke, the weight of their lie finally settling into the dust of their home. The journey ended at the gates of a sprawling estate in Egypt. Joseph was led into the courtyard, a space teeming with activity, disorganized and loud. He did not look back at the road he had traveled. He watched the way the servants moved, the haphazard stacking of supplies, the wasted effort in every corner. He began his work immediately. He hauled heavy stone jars, reorganized the grain stores by weight and quality, and mapped the daily routines of the staff. His movements were calculated, efficient, and never faltered. Where others saw a massive, unmanageable estate, Joseph saw a system that could be optimized. He started before sunrise, his hands calloused from constant labor, and finished long after the lamps were lit. Potiphar watched from the balcony, observing the quiet transformation of his household. The chaos smoothed into a rhythm. The waste vanished. Within months, the keys to the pantry and the ledgers of the storehouses were placed into Joseph's hands. He walked the perimeter of the grounds with a new authority, his gaze fixed on every detail, ensuring the estate thrived under his watch. He had moved from the bottom of a pit to the center of a kingdom's power, his integrity the only tool he had ever needed to climb. The order Joseph had built began to fray the moment the household went quiet. He was checking the final ledgers of the day when Potiphar's wife entered the room. She moved toward him, her demands sharp and immediate. Joseph backed away, his hands raised, and turned toward the exit to leave the chamber. She grabbed his arm, pulling him back, but he tore himself free and ran into the hallway. She screamed, a sound that cut through the silent house and brought the guards running from the courtyard. She pointed at Joseph, her story ready, twisting the truth into a weapon. Potiphar arrived, his face hardening as he listened to her claim. Joseph tried to speak, but the captain of the guards signaled the men. They seized him, pinning his arms behind his back. The keys to the estate were snatched from his belt and tossed to the floor. He was dragged through the halls, his heels scraping against the stone. He did not fight back. He watched the walls pass by. The life he had earned, dissolving in seconds. The heavy wooden door of the house swung open, revealing the path to the dungeon. They shoved him out into the dust, the sun blinding him as the gate slammed shut, locking the world of the estate away from him forever. The heavy iron bolt slid into place, sealing the world away. Joseph stood in the center of the cell, the air thick with dampness and the smell of stagnant water. He did not sink to the floor. He paced the small perimeter, counting his steps, 4 paces across, 4 paces back, until the rhythm grounded him. Days bled into weeks, marked only by the sliver of light that traveled across the ceiling. He learned the language of the prison. The heavy footfalls of the guards, the distant rattle of chains, and the slow drip of water against stone. He did not let his mind wander into the past. He kept his body moving, pushing against the walls to maintain strength, his breathing steady and deliberate. He listened to the other prisoners, learning their stories and understanding their grievances, offering a word of logic where there was only chaos. The 2 years stretched out, an unending sequence of shadows, yet he kept his focus sharp. He worked in the dark, organizing the chores of the inmates, ensuring the communal space remained clean. Every morning he woke before the others, staring at the small, barred opening high in the wall. He remained ready, his posture upright, his eyes clear, waiting for the moment when the silence of the dungeon would finally be broken by the call of a new purpose. The heavy door did not rattle. It swung open with a smooth, oiled glide. The guards did not shove. They gestured. Joseph stepped out of the dark and into the blinding brightness of the palace corridors. He moved with a steady, measured stride, his eyes adjusting to the gold-leafed walls and the sudden rush of air. He was led into the throne room, where the air felt heavy with the collective anxiety of the advisors. Pharaoh sat on the dais, his hands gripping the armrests, his gaze fixed on the distance. He spoke of the dreams, the 7 fat cattle devoured by the 7 lean ones. Joseph stood still, listening to the king describe the impossible cycle of hunger. He did not hesitate. He spoke clearly, his voice steady against the marble floor, cutting through the murmurs of the court. He mapped out the years of plenty, and the inevitable years of drought that would follow. He laid out a plan for storage and survival, speaking with a precision that turned the king's fear into quiet focus. The room grew still. The advisors leaned forward, their faces shifting from skepticism to realization. Joseph finished, his hands folded, his stance unwavering. Pharaoh looked at him, the king's grip on the throne loosening, the weight of the kingdom now resting on the words of a man who had been in chains only hours before. Pharaoh rose, his movements deliberate. He reached to his right hand and pulled the heavy gold signet ring from his finger. The metal caught the light as he stepped down the dais, the court watching in absolute silence. He reached for Joseph's hand and pressed the ring into his palm, closing his fingers over it. The seal of Egypt was now held by the man who had been a prisoner at dawn. Pharaoh gestured to his advisors. They bowed, their foreheads touching the cold stone floor. Joseph did not pause to absorb the change. He immediately turned toward the high officials, his voice projecting across the grand hall. He outlined the logistics of the coming harvest, demanding that every city be prepared to store the excess grain. He ordered the construction of massive granaries and the immediate mobilization of the state overseers. His instructions were precise, covering the taxation of the land and the preservation of the surplus. He walked through the palace, his stride purposeful, followed by men who were now his subordinates. He was no longer waiting for the future, he was actively shaping it. By the time the sun set, the machinery of the entire kingdom was already moving at his command, redirected to stave off the hunger that would soon threaten the world. The sky turned a permanent, brittle white. The fields, once lush, cracked into deep fissures that swallowed the roots of the grain. The 7 years of plenty ended in a single season of parched heat. Outside the borders of Egypt, the earth grew silent and unproductive. People across every nation watched their own stores vanish into dust. They turned their gaze toward the Nile. A steady stream of travelers began to arrive at the gates of the major cities. They carried empty sacks and desperate expressions, their eyes fixed on the massive stone granaries Joseph had ordered built. Joseph stood on the balcony overlooking the distribution centers. He signaled to the overseers. The gates swung open. He watched the lines form, hundreds, then thousands of people from distant lands, all seeking the grain he had secured. He managed the flow with absolute control, ensuring every ration was weighed and every ledger was updated. The famine was a predator, but here, in the heart of the kingdom, the supply held firm. The world outside was starving, yet beneath the shadow of the great storage houses, the rhythmic sound of grain hitting the scales became the heartbeat of survival. Egypt had become the only sanctuary left on earth. 10 men stood at the edge of the great courtyard, their movements stiff from the long trek. They were gaunt, their skin mapped with the dust of the desert, their hands calloused and shaking from lack of food. They did not look like the men who had once stood over a pit, laughing. They were led forward by the guards, their eyes downcast, stepping into the cool, shadowed interior of the central hall. Joseph sat upon the dais, his gaze fixed on the group. He saw the familiar set of their shoulders, the way they huddled together, the same posture they had held years ago in the fields. They reached the center of the room and stopped. Without a word of command, the weight of their desperation forced them to their knees. They leaned forward, pressing their foreheads against the stone floor in a gesture of total submission. Joseph remained still. He watched as they groveled at his feet, their bodies bent low in the very configuration he had seen in his dreams as a boy. The sheaves of wheat. The stars. The memory of the vision snapped into focus. He looked down at the men, his face unreadable, while the silence in the hall stretched until it was thick enough to touch. Joseph gestured to his lead steward. The command was whispered, hidden behind the routine of measuring grain. While the 10 brothers focused on the heavy sacks being hoisted onto their pack animals, the steward moved with practiced ease. He reached into the supplies, slipped the heavy silver cup into the mouth of Benjamin's sack, and pulled the cord tight. The brothers shouldered their burdens, their faces etched with the relief of survival. They turned and headed toward the city gates, walking with a renewed, hurried pace. They had not traveled more than a mile when the sound of horses thundered behind them. The guards surrounded the group, blocking the path. They did not speak. They simply began to cut the ropes on every sack. Flour spilled into the dirt, grain scattered across the road as the men searched each bag with brutal efficiency. They moved from the eldest to the youngest. When they reached Benjamin's sack, the lead guard plunged his hand deep into the center. He pulled the silver cup into the sunlight. The metal caught the glare of the desert sun. The brothers stopped, their expressions shifting from confusion to cold. Absolute terror, as the guards leveled their spears at the youngest brother. The guards closed the circle, their spears lowered toward Benjamin. He stood frozen, his sack lying open in the dust. The brothers did not run, they did not fight. They stood in a tight, jagged line, watching the steel points inches from the boy. Then, movement broke the stillness. Judah stepped forward, placing himself directly between the guards and his younger brother. He did not look at the silver cup. He looked at the captain of the guard. He dropped his staff, raised his empty hands, and stood with his back to Benjamin. "Take me instead," he said. The voice was low but carried across the silent road. Judah did not flinch as the guards shifted their focus to him. He spoke of their father Jacob and the gray hairs that would surely descend to the grave in sorrow if the boy did not return. He described the pact they had made, the gravity of the promise, and the cost of the life he was now offering to pay. He knelt in the dirt, wrists held out for the binding ropes, waiting for the iron to bite into his skin. The brothers stood behind him, silent, watching the man who had once been their loudest voice now offer his final freedom to save the youngest among them. Joseph did not take the risks. He stared at Judah, then at the line of men who had once cast him into a pit. He turned his head and waved a hand at the guards. They hesitated, looked at the silver cup, then withdrew, their footsteps fading down the stone corridor. Joseph walked to the heavy wooden door and bolted it shut. The silence in the room became heavy, pressing against the walls. He looked at his brothers. He tried to speak, but only a ragged sound escaped. He began to weep. It was not a quiet grief. It was a loud, raw sound that echoed off the high ceilings. He covered his face, his shoulders shaking with the force of it. The brothers stood rigid, their eyes wide, their hands trembling at their sides. They looked at the man in authority, then at each other, searching for a sign that this was a trick. Joseph dropped his hands. He took a single heavy step toward them. He shouted, "I am Joseph!" "Is my father still alive?" The brothers did not move. They could not speak. The color drained from their faces as the reality of the moment shattered their defenses, leaving them trapped in a silence born of pure, paralyzing disbelief. The brothers did not move, but the terror began to ebb as Joseph stepped into their circle. He reached out and placed a hand on the shoulder of the man closest to him. The contact was firm, steady, and deliberate. He looked into their eyes, one by one, and did not see enemies. He saw the path that had led him to this seat of power. "Come closer," he said. They shuffled forward, still hesitant, their heads bowed. Joseph gestured to the empty room. "You meant evil against me," he stated, his voice now calm and resonant. "But God meant it for good." He spoke of the famine, the grain, and the survival of their house. He pointed to the doorway, signaling that the years of separation were ending. One by one, the brothers lowered their guard. The man who had been sold for silver finally leaned into the embrace of the men who had sold him. They wept together, their voices overlapping in the quiet space. The long, jagged history of the pit and the dungeon vanished in the heat of the reunion. They were no longer captives of their past actions. They stood together, a broken family finally made whole, ready to face the years of famine as one unit. The pit was never meant to be the end. It was the foundation upon which a nation survived the lean years. What began as an act of betrayal in the dust of the fields became the very structure that preserved a family and a people. Joseph's story serves as a reminder that the darkest moments often hold the seeds of a future that remains unseen until the final piece falls into place. But the history of courage does not stop in Egypt. Next week, the narrative shifts to a throne room where a single woman stands alone. She walks into the presence of a king, uninvited, risking her life to speak for a people on the brink of destruction. It is the story of Esther, and it is a tale of defiance that changed the course of an empire. Subscribe to this channel so you do not miss the start of her journey. The throne room awaits. The challenge is set. Make sure you are here to see how she faces it.